Chapter 6 The Wailing Barracks, in which our heroine is tested. Now, with something resembling directions, Yen moved at a brisk pace. She was relieved when she finally saw crowds again. The uncomfortable solitude she had silently fallen into was past. That wasn't to say that she had stopped being nervous about applying for the guild. She had jumped from Curl's Den to Curl's Den, and she couldn't tell how many more leaps the day had for her. All Yen could do was hope that this one was the last. There were more landmarks along the path, but with the afternoon sun slowly setting, Yen was no longer dawdling to look at them. One was a very tall structure, built on stilts above what seemed to be an empty lake bed. Another was a long building where dozens, maybe hundreds, of people congregated outside its entrance. Yen could only guess that the former building was some kind of guild hall, and the latter was almost certainly the city markets. She was hard-pressed to imagine what else would draw such a loud throng. It was a place worth remembering, assuming that she'd have enough gil to make use of their services. It was hard for her to imagine she'd ever have that much gil. A cool breeze rushed up to meet Yen, the air suddenly smelling like lake water. If the old man's directions were right, that meant she was very, very close to her destination. Sure enough, as the road bent north, and the glistening lake came into view, Yen could see a squat structure in the distance. It had a rigidity of design, with a dark-colored wood construction and a low awning over the patio just before the entrance. Despite how functional or formed the guild hall seemed to have been built, it was still ornately decorated. Red canvas was draped along the mouth of the hall, and just above the main entrance was a large, near-featureless oval of white bleached wood. In a vague mimicry of a face, two deep sockets had been carved for eyes, and not one feature more. Yen stared at it, uncertain what to make of the thing. It was, at the very least, striking. Resting outside the barracks, alone and in groups, were lancers in training soaking in the cool lake air and the spring breeze between training bouts. They did not carry their weapons outside, it seems, but they were still clad in their padded training armor. Most of their chest pieces had patches over where the fabric had been gouged, and the people wearing them seemed exhausted and even bruised. It was hard not to feel intimidated by what must be a brutal regimen. Not that it changed anything. No matter how ruthless the training, it was what she needed to do. As Yennefer walked towards the barracks, one by one the many lancers turned to watch her approach. Not one of them said a word as she kept walking, one foot after the other, to the door. She halted at the threshold, trying to screw up the courage to take the next step forwards. Yen closed her eyes, took one last deep breath, and stepped inside. The interior of the Lancers Guild was as interesting a contradiction in design as its exterior had been. The walls had been constructed without frills, though not without any pride in the craftsmanship. The buildings seemed as sturdy as they came, and the wood had been waxed to a gentle luster. Like outside, however, the guild seemed to have transformed the space, draping banners over the bare surfaces and placing benches all along the reception area. At the room's furthest corner, a great door leading into the training hall was open. Through it came a flurry of clacks from wood cracking into wood, and the grunts from the trainees using their weapons. The din was immense, but those who stayed in the receiving hall seemed to have gotten used to it. Next to the door sat a large desk, and behind it stood a Midlander Huron woman. Yen took a strange comfort in that, for once, she seemed the taller party. The receptionist had curtly cut raven black hair and wore what seemed to be the same training garb as the lancers outside. She had no spear near her and seemed rather engrossed in the paperwork in front of her. Yen wasn't sure if that meant that the woman was a lancer in full who had been given the role, or if she was a receptionist first and simply was asked to help with the training from time to time. Directly ahead of Yen was the last feature of the reception hall, and it was by far the oddest. Like the one hanging outside, a great whitewood effigy of a face was mounted against the wall. Unlike its sibling, from this statue's deeply carved eyes streamed black paint like tears. It only served to make the object more unsettling, more unusual. Yen felt torn between asking someone what the faces meant and very much not wanting to know some grim Gridanian secret. It made a shiver run down Yen's spine. It wasn't too unlikely that her reaction was exactly why the thing had been put up. The receptionist looked up from her work, noticing for the first time that Yen had entered. She stood up straighter before calling out. "Hey!" she yelled. Yen spun about to face her, startled, only to see the woman waving her over. "Can I help you?" "Oh, Yen replied, quickly hurrying over. Her pulse was beginning to outpace her again, leaving her feeling all the more precarious. I. She paused, collecting herself for an instant before pressing on. I would like to apply for membership. A blink of realization. Guild membership, I mean. The receptionist smiled knowingly. She had obviously seen this sort of frantic applicant before. Yen might not even be the first one that day. She leaned forward on the table, resting her palms on the desktop. We would be glad to have you, but before we continue, there are 3 things we need to cover. She raised one of her hands and extended a thumb. First, it's the Guildmaster's decision to accept you, not mine. Her index finger rose to meet her thumb. Second, the Guild will provide you with a set of training armor and a basic spear, but that is all. If you wish to acquire proper equipment or replace damaged pieces, that will need to come from your own purse. She smiled thinly. Fortunately, Guild members are always in demand, so you're not like to starve. Her middle finger rose to join its siblings. Lastly, and most importantly, if you are accepted into the Guild, you will become a representative of Gridania's most ancient tradition. Her face became suddenly grave. Dishonor yourself, or the Lancers Guild, and you will never set foot again inside Gridania's walls. I trust I make myself clear? Yen swallowed, nodding. Very, she timidly agreed. The fingers returned to rest, and the receptionist pushed off her desk with a rather mean smile. Good, she chirped, grinning toothily. Then I'll have your name for the role. Yennefer. Yen answered as fast as she could. Yennefer Falle. The woman tapped at her temple with a finger, mouthing the name. After a moment, she nodded. All right, wait here, she said, already starting to walk. I'll let the Guildmaster know that you're waiting. Before Yen could say a word in response, the receptionist had already rounded the corner into the training hall. Sighing, Yen closed her half-open mouth and leaned against the desk. She would have to be comfortable with waiting. Minutes dragged on. The receptionist had yet to return, and Yen was growing increasingly unsure. Were they truly that busy? Or were they simply trying to wait her out? Was it some kind of test? If it was, Yen couldn't begin to guess what the right answer was. All she could do was stand and wait. Time passed at an agonizing pace, and as the half-bell mark approached, Yen could feel her patience wearing thin. She was certain that she was being played with now, but in what way was still a mystery. It was rapidly reaching the point where she no longer cared what the motive was. She was only losing daylight waiting, time she had little interest in wasting. Fine, she hissed, pushing herself away from the increasingly uncomfortable impromptu armrest. What's the worst that could happen? Quite a bit, she thought sardonically, but she wasn't about to let that stop her. She could feel eyes boring into her as the Lancers resting on the benches watched her storm through the entrance to the practice hall. Yen was perfectly happy to let them gawk, a feeling that she was growing more and more accustomed to. The seemingly newfound defiant pride in her heart had yet to dim. As she entered the training area, her eyes took in the scene of a dozen Lancers, all in the midst of their regiments. They practiced in pairs, standing only a few foam apart, spears aimed at their opponents. There would be brief moments of peace, as the Lancers watched each other warily, that would be broken by flurries of well-rehearsed violence. The polearms in their hands, with rare exception longer than their wielder, suddenly became blurs of motion as Lancers stabbed, swung, parried, and swept. The air would fill with the crash of wood against wood, interrupted only when 2 trainees paused to catch their breath and reassess, or when the sound of ripping fabric resounded through the training hall. Yen watched a dozen Lancers do this dance at a speed she struggled to follow. She had never held any illusions towards her own mastery of the Lancer's art, but to see these trained warriors practice fully set in just how far from the summit she felt. On another day, that knowledge would have knocked the wind out of her, maybe even tomorrow, assuming, of course, that she would ever be allowed back inside. Today, though, for reasons she couldn't put a name to, but surging through her nonetheless, all she felt was a swell of confidence. She wasn't at their level today, but she could be. She would be. She had to be. Yen scanned the room, hoping to catch a glance at the receptionist. Strangely, the woman seemed to have disappeared from the face of the star. Failing to find her, Yen switched to trying to guess who, if anyone, was the guildmaster. She wasn't truthfully sure what to look for. Someone tall, someone covered in scars from head to toe, someone carrying some nigh magical lance for a weapon. No one seemed to quite fit that bill. For a moment, Yen worried that the guildmaster had also disappeared, perhaps to the same god's forsaken corner as his underling. Before she could decide on turning around and giving up for today, she saw someone unlike the rest. A single lancer, a Midlander Hiraman shorter than Yennefer by half a fulm, stood at the fringe of a training bout. He wore the same practice armor as the rest, wore a simple spear like the rest, and like many of his fellows, wore his blonde hair quite shortly. By physical description, he was entirely unexceptional, but his demeanor set him apart. His arms were folded dispassionately over his chest, his face fixed by a look of stern focus. Above all other qualities, what set him apart from the rest was that, no matter how close a spearhead came to hitting him, no matter how few ilms separated him from the trainees, the man never moved, never so much as flinched. He seemed to be made of stone, which would at least explain his rigid visage. He seemed set apart from his peers in a way that was both striking and impossible to describe. That man was Yen's best guess, which meant that the only problem left was to get to him. Yennefer sharply exhaled through her nose. She could barely hear the sound over the clamor, but the sensation sharpened both her resolve and focus. Steadily, she started to walk forward towards the man, a journey that even from afar seemed to be quite perilous. Several pairs of trainees were dueling all about the floor between Yen and the man, and more than a few seemed adventurous with their footwork. If Yen didn't want to end up on her arse, she needed to be careful. Almost immediately, things went awry. Yen had walked only a few fulm when a pair of duelists suddenly shuffled in front of her, battling lances barring the way. Trying to remain unperturbed, she took a step to the right, only for a spear to suddenly careen into her gut. The force of it caused Yen to double over, dropping to her knees as the wind was forced out of her. It had been delivered so quickly and decisively that it didn't seem an accident. And that neither combatant paused to check on her reinforced that thought. If this was a test, it was in very poor taste. Another lance butt jerked in her direction, again seeming accidental. Yen had barely a moment to respond, throwing herself forward to duck underneath the attack. The moment it sailed overhead, the lancer holding the offending spear was suddenly set upon by his opponent and instinctively moved backwards. A foot came diving down towards Yen's now exposed back. Again, with no time to so much as think, she forced herself to roll along the ground. Not away, as good sense would assume. Something told her at an instinctive level that this was the right course. Her spear was still strapped along her back, and while she had so far avoided careening it into anyone or anything, she no longer was so concerned. The reaction was instant. The lancer above her made another step backwards, probably intending to bring it down on Yen. Instead, his ankle connected with the haft of her spear. Immediately, the lancer let out a shout as he was swept off his feet. Yen had only just enough momentum to avoid being crushed underneath, but now she was in the dangerous middle ground between the two combatants. The other trainee paused, unsure what to do in this strange scenario. Even if he was part of the test, Yen had altered the plan enough to befuddle him. In the end, even though she knew her conscience would give her hells for it later, Yen acted first. Pushing herself as quickly as she could to her feet, she spun around in a half-crouch to face the surviving trainee and punched him as hard as she could in his stomach. The novice staggered backwards, completely unprepared and now paying for it. Yen didn't wait to apologize, darting forward to clear the gap between her and her target. If any other lancers were in on the plan, they were caught completely flat-footed. No one moved an ilm as she made the few fulm gap in a few seconds. The man did not so much as move his head as Yennefer stepped to his side. Stop. His voice was even, and not raised, only barely audible over the rest of the room. Immediately, the twin lancers skirmishing before him disengaged, taking a short step away from each other and raising their weapons to the ceiling. The rest of the room ignored the command, continuing to spar around them. Suddenly, Yen realized she was in the storm's eye. The man turned to face her, and for the first time, Yen noticed the deep scar that cut across his celion, long healed but still prominent. Your solution was quite interesting, Miss Fall. Yen blinked, surprised. You know my name? She stammered. The scarred lancer nodded, more quick jabbing motion with his chin than anything else. As the master of the Lancers Guild, it is my duty to know the name of every lancer in our roll. He smiled thinly. Indulge me. Why did you do that? Yen's head was swimming. Even if her conscious hadn't noticed what the guildmaster had said, her subconscious certainly had. I'm sorry, what? You could have stepped back, tried another approach. You could even have given up. Many have. The hearer's stare burrowed into her relentlessly, unblinkingly. He had blown past her question and continued to ask his own. He paused for a moment, his stance nearly imperceptibly shifting. Your response to being impeded was novel, but while your follow-through was understandable, it was also unnecessary. His expression hardened. As a lancer, you must take great care to control yourself as much as your spear. Am I clear? Yen nodded shakily, still processing it all. Yes, sir? She rested her hand against her forehead. I am a lancer? The guildmaster's smile broadened, actually breaking, albeit only slightly, through his stony veneer. You were a lancer the moment you gave Jillian your name. The only way that could have changed is if you had walked away. A hand gently tightened around Yen's throat. Twice in one day, she had feared that she would be turned away at the door. Twice, she had been proven wrong. It was all suddenly so overwhelming. Thank you, she smiled, sniffling. Thank you so much. Do not thank me yet, the guildmaster said wryly. My name is Wayne, and from this moment on, I will expect much from you. A sharp look crossed his eyes. To be a lancer is to be without fear. I will teach you how. He looked past Yennefer to the training hall and the lancers in it. All of this was just the first lesson.